If you've ever thought about running a challenge right on your podcast, you're going to want to listen to this episode. We sit down with Uncommonly More production client Racheal Cook to talk about exactly how she uses 2 challenges every single year in her podcast. Welcome to Uncommonly More with Stacey Harris. I am Stacey. I'm the host of this show and the CEO of podcast production agency Uncommonly More. My team and I work with podcasters just like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of sales teams with professional, strategic podcast production. You know what? I think that's enough. Let's get into the show and we'll talk more there. Welcome. I'm super stoked to sit down with Rach today. Racheal Cook is one of my favorite people. She is a business strategist. She runs an incredibly cool community called the CEO Collective. She's got a great podcast called Promote Yourself to CEO. We produce that show here at Uncommonly More, and I wanted to have her on because Racheal and I often like to sit down and nerd out about marketing stuff, but also we both have a really deep belief and commitment around using your podcast as an asset, building episodes that can be repurposed, that can be reused, that can be shared again and again. And she's going to talk about how repurposing a challenge is kind of how her podcast in its current iteration started. And we're going to talk about how we use 2 challenges in her content calendar to get different results based on when we need to pull those levers. It's a fantastic conversation. I'm really excited for you to listen to it. Ahead of that, though, I want to nudge you. If this is something on your radar for 2022, if this is something that you want to be looking at, if this is something you want to do in Q4, we need to talk. We need to sit down because this is the kind of show we produce. This is the kind of work we want to help you create. We want to help you put out there. These are the assets we want to help you build. So head over to uncommonlymore.com and learn more about podcast production with our team. And without any further ado, hear from our client, Racheal Cook. Welcome. I now have Racheal with us and I'm super, super stoked. I already loved you up in the intro, but will you please give them the this is who I am spiel about yourself?
Sure. If only they could see your little hand movements as you're
That's true. If only this was a video podcast and they saw the random dancing that happens, even when I'm talking to myself.
So for those of you who don't know me, I am Racheal Cook. I am the host of the Promote Yourself to CEO podcast and founder of the CEO Collective, where we help women entrepreneurs to start and scale sustainable businesses. I think we're rolling into year 14, 15 of being an entrepreneur. And this is, several iterations of my work that I am into. But I am so excited to be on with you today and talk about how the podcast has made a lot of this happen.
I'm really excited to talk about the podcast with you because I think your show is such an example of using this as a tool, not just to nurture, not just to fill up an endless pit of value, which I think is sometimes the falsehood we get stuck in with podcasting, is that this is a nurture tool. So it's just got to be value. And your show does a really good job of being super valuable while being really clear that this is a decision point. Are we stepping forward? Are we staying where we at? Are we stepping forward? Are we staying where we at with every episode? How long have you been podcasting for now?
Technically since 2013, with the earliest iteration of my business, my brand was the Yogipreneur. That was my first step into the consulting world, was specifically for yoga business owners. And so I had a podcast then called Yogipreneur Radio, which I did for probably about 2 years. And then there were a couple of things that happened around 2014 for me that started to shift out of the Yogipreneur brand. Mainly, my audience was starting to grow. And if you happen to know a yoga teacher, you also happen to know they're probably a yoga teacher and a life coach, or a yoga teacher and a holistic healthcare coach, or it's I'm a yoga teacher and type of situation. So my audience started kind of expanding and I had more people saying, well, I'm not a yogipreneur, but I'm learning so much from you. Can I work with you? So I started to broaden things and moved into my own personal brand because it gave me the most flexibility. And at that point, I had to make the hard call to let go of the Yogipreneur brand, which if anybody's had to, Stacey, you've had to do.
So hard.
It is so hard to take a brand you've been building for so many years and then be like, "Ugh, this isn't really where I want to go anymore. I need to like
Yeah.
let it evolve." And what happened was, it was about 2015. I knew that I was going in a new direction. And I also had run this challenge for the very first time in 2014. It was called the Fired Up and Focused Challenge. At the time that I ran it, it was a 28-day video challenge that I created at the very last minute, right as I wanted to launch something. I had scrapped a previous launch plan that was already recorded and edited in place and decided, oh, I'm going to create a challenge. By the way, it also had a 1-year-old at home and
Because you're a
3-year-old.
crazy person.
Yes. But
Yeah,
what
don't forget the 3-year-old twins.
yeah. But what happened really changed a lot of things for me. One, in 2014, 2015, people weren't really running challenges as a way to grow their business. And what was interesting to me is because I have a lot of clients in the health space, I would see people sign up for challenges. Like they're a challenge to become a better runner, a challenge for like whatever physical activity they were doing. We did yoga challenges all the time, like 30 days of yoga. And so for me, it was like, oh, this makes sense. It's small incremental improvement on a specific thing. So I ran this challenge. It was massively successful. It confirmed I was going in the right direction. And later that year, I decided to take the challenge and I did a couple of things with it because I'm a big believer that once you create something that you can tell is really resonating, is super valuable, I wanted to turn it into other things. So I took the challenge and I did two big things. One, I turned the challenge into a book. I literally downloaded all the audio, had them all transcribed, took the transcripts, had somebody edit them into a book, and you can buy the book. It's on Amazon. It was an Amazon bestseller for productivity and entrepreneurship. And
That's
it's
so
still
cool.
available. And then I recorded the book as a podcast. So my current podcast, actually, if you were to look in the Libsyn thing, it says Get Fired Up and Focus. That was the original podcast version of the podcast. And what I did was I launched it with all 20 something challenges in the podcast. And I just recorded like an intro and a wrap up and whatever. Whenever you change formats, you have to make sure that it's a complete thing. It's not just like copy and paste. But a few things started happening from both of those experiments. One, when you create a book, and I self-published it, I was able to give it away freely. It became the best marketing tool I could have imagined. Because I published it on Amazon, I could set it to be free for a period of time. I had people find me on Amazon. Amazon is a search engine and they will find you there. On the podcast, it was the same thing. I hadn't committed to continuing the podcast beyond the challenge. I just thought, okay, this will be like a small closed container. But what happened is people were finding the podcast because apparently there's not that many helpful productivity podcasts specifically for women who are in business and maybe don't have or want to work 80 hours a week. And here my podcast about the challenge was around, hey, I work 25 hours a week and this is how I do it. So I came back to the podcast because once I saw that I was getting an audience organically building over there, I was like, okay, time to do this again. And so we started using that as my primary content platform, meaning I moved from, and I've done everything for like my core nurture content. I've done blogs. I did a whole experiment. 1 year, I did a whole year of Facebook Lives every single week. And what I found was after I did all these different things, the thing that felt the best to me was doing the podcast. I'm a good writer and I know I'm a really good writer, but I also take a very long time to write. So for me to put together something that was what I wanted to say, I mean, it could take me a day or two. And that's a long time for a piece of content. A video, I don't mind being on video, but the work it takes to be ready every single day. It's one thing if you're batching videos, knocking out a bunch of things. But if you're showing up live every single week, and I had children at home and all this stuff going on,
I was going to say, videos and toddlers are not things that work super well together.
Videos and toddlers are incredibly difficult. So
unless they're the point of the video.
No, and they weren't at all. And so I was like, you know what? This is very time consuming and stressful. But the thing I loved was just being able to sit down and press record. And so I came back to the podcast and just has focused on it since then. So you see the behind the scenes. This podcast has been evolving over the last 5 or 6 years, but it remains the number one tool for me to get clients.
I love that you said that specifically about the evolution. I get so many people who reach out to me who want to launch a show, and they're so fixated on getting it perfect. And the reality is like any medium, you're not going to get any better at it until you're in it. You're not going to figure out what works and what doesn't work until you're in it. The thing I love that you talked about is that evolution, and that there's always been a focus for the show to get someone a quick win, a small result, so that they can decide what the next step is for them. They can get a feel for what working with you is like, what learning from you is like, and they can decide if it's for them or if it's not for them. I got to be honest. One of the things I love most about having a podcast is when people decide I'm not for them based on listening to the podcast. Because I'm like, cool, let's find your right solution, because there's a reason there's lots of people who do what I do so that you can find the right one for you. And so I love that you talked about that. And I am obsessed with the fact that it started as a challenge, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was how you utilize challenges in your podcast. Because I think a lot of conversation has happened over the last few years around, like, it's a little bit harder to get people in to a challenge than it was in 2017, 2018, 2019, because it's not the new thing on the block. They're everywhere. No. Also, for the love of God, people, they don't all need to be in a Facebook group. There's lots of ways to do it. Lots and lots and lots of ways to do it. Get creative, figure out where people are consuming your content. And you did exactly that. And you've kept a lot of your challenges, I mean, all of your challenges as podcast content. We have one, you have one coming up. And I want to talk a little bit about how specifically running challenges on the podcast has evolved for you. Because I know we've run the BYE challenge a few times in the last last couple of years. And sometimes it's the same and sometimes it's new. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, you're into the podcast. You've been podcasting for a while. You've Fired Up and Focused, I think, is a great way for us to start this, because it was a 28-day podcast series to start. It was the start of the podcast. What does the Fired Up and Focused challenge on the podcast look like now?
So now we have cut it down to 10 days. And to be honest, I'll probably cut it down to shorter, to like 5.
I'm over here being like, it's going to be 5. It's going to be 5.
She's over here holding up her hand like 5. Well, we've run it as 10 for the last couple years. And the reason for that is not because I don't want to be generous with the content. It's because people were getting stuck in the content. And this happens quite often. And my purpose for the challenge isn't just to fire hose them with so much information that they can't actually do something with it. We also found that since my business model has shifted a little bit, the Fired Up and Focused challenge works really well in my ecosystem as the front end lead magnet, because productivity is something a lot of my audience is concerned about. Like, they're struggling to get things done, to stay focused, to figure out how to do it all, right? And cutting it down will make it perfect for like the front end of my marketing ecosystem, like the first way to engage with me. So we're thinking about cutting it down to 5 days the next time we run it. Now, conversely, the Best Year Ever challenge has always been 5 days. And this one started a little bit differently, but kind of similarly. Like, all my favorite content that ends up kind of becoming the best content I create, it came about because I had the realization that I had a process I was doing that, to me, I'm thinking, well, surely everyone else plans this way, right?
I love this, because we all have this thing that we're like, everyone thinks this way. And then everyone else is like, wait, what? That's a great idea.
Yeah. And I had a moment where I was at some event or something, and we were doing this, exercise where we're supposed to map out what your head's going to look like and how you're going to do all the things. And here I am, because I have this process. I was like, I had my little calendar drawn. I knew exactly what went where. I knew exactly how it was happening. Everybody else's looked like a toddler was making a mind map of how to do marketing. And I'm like, no, marketing and sales, it's a process. It's supposed to move forward. It's not supposed to be just like ideas all over the place with no focus. So that was for me. I was like, okay, maybe I have some frameworks here that I can teach. And these are things that honestly, they come from the consulting world. These are things I used to do with C-suite executives when I'd run a 2 or 3 day strategic planning retreat. I just streamlined it to work for my business. And then I was like, oh yeah, maybe not everybody has a consulting background and maybe this would be helpful. So I created a challenge. And when I ran it the first time, I did it the challenge is a video challenge. But what I found with this one that was a little different from the Fired Up and Focused challenge is I started posting it on the podcast and it became like an annual thing where like every year at the end of the year in Q4, we're going to run the challenge. And
Spoiler alert, it's coming up. Get ready.
It's coming up. Go sign up for it. Well, what I found is the first time you run something, sometimes you might feel like, oh, I can't run that again. But because this was an annual thing that everyone needs to do, I didn't have that hesitation of like, well, maybe I should do something different. I knew that this would just be an annual thing that I was going to do. And I heard from my audience, they were like, oh, I'm so glad we're doing the challenge again. Even if they had done it before, even if they had gone through it multiple times, they still want to go through it again with me. And that was when I was like, ding, 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 this is perfect. So
and they invite their friends and
they invite their friends. And I mean, they've written blog posts about it. They've shared on social media. They tell other people, they bring I've had people who send me pictures from like their hotel room where them and their best friend have locked themselves in for a weekend to do it. And I'm like, this is what I want to create. This is the type of content I want to create.
I love that. And I think that when we start looking at I think so often with challenges, we think about having to put them behind a wall. We need you to opt in first, or if we give this to you, you won't opt in. And I think that is what often keeps it sort of kills the shareability of it. It makes it hard to create this sort of event-like feel. You know, you talk about women sort of buddying up and locking themselves in hotel rooms and getting this done. That can't happen when you put everything behind the opt-in. And if you put the content front facing that goes with something that is behind an opt-in, like the workbook that goes with the Best Year Ever challenge, like it works as you want it to, but now the core content, you talking them through it, can be shareable, can be something that gets talked about in blog posts and featured in videos and shared on Instagram in a way that gets more people into that email list versus sort of almost gatekeeping the content, like being really sort of stingy with it under the guise that we're being super generous and it's a free challenge. Like there's a weird juxtaposition there. And so I love that you've been using this as an annual event. How many challenges are you at now sort of through the podcast? It's just the 2, right? Fired Up and Focused.
Just the 2.
Yeah.
And we try to run Best Year Ever, in Q4 towards the end of the year. People are thinking about planning. And Fired Up and Focused, I've played around with when we run it. Honestly, I run it when I don't want to create a ton of new content and I knew it'd be a great list builder. And I just want to have something in the can to just be like, hey, Stacy, I want to take some time off. Can you run this challenge for me?
Thank you for saying that, because it's exactly what I wanted you to say, because it's true. It allows you have this 1-2 punch of sort of both versions of how having a challenge on your podcast can work. A set event where people are looking forward to it. It's sort of a standard event we have on your sales calendar as far as it leads into the things we need it to at a timely, like it makes sense where it is. And then we have this sort of like back pocket break in case of emergency. I need space. Here's something really cool we can deliver. And also, I really love that on the flip side of I've got plenty of time to record, but like we know this thing works to get email list building. And we know we have this coming up downstream, but we don't really have anything we want to sell right this second. Cool. Yep. Let's plug and play some email list growth. I really encourage you, as you're listening to this, think about where can you have both of these levers that are pullable. one that is a pullable, this leads to that kind of sales event, and a break in case of emergency. I need to love up the list. I need to get out of my own head and away from my computer for a little while, whatever it is, asset. And notice that these are whole actual assets that we can use again and again. And let's talk about that, because I think there's two extremes here. I'm going to record this once and use it for 25 years. Or I have to record it brand new every time. And so it's not actually an asset. The idea is just sort of intellectual property that exists in my brain. Whereas for you, I think you do a really good job of being in the middle here. How often do you refresh versus let it roll?
Oh, this is such a great question. And I'm like, maybe I should look up my podcast, because in the coming months, I can tell you that I repurpose a lot of content. And I would want to back up for a second. You use the word asset, and this is something I use a lot in my business with my clients, because I find that too many entrepreneurs are on the content creation hamster wheel. And what happens is they create this frantic pace of thinking they've got to churn out content every single week, like they're freaking NBC or something. And the reality is you don't. And think about this. How many times have you seen your favorite show in the world, and then you go back and watch the reruns? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've rewatched all of Gilmore Girls.
It's West Wing for me.
We all have our thing, right? But I never think, oh gosh, they should have, instead of putting out the reruns, they should have just done the whole thing over again, right? Like,
and Year in a Life really taught us that wasn't the best option.
Yeah. But my point is that, I think we get caught in this idea that we have to constantly be pumping out content. And truly, for most of us aren't running media businesses. Most of us are running service-based businesses, expert-based businesses, online course creation, info-based businesses. And those businesses don't necessarily need a ton of content. They just need the right content. And they need the right content to be showing up frequently enough that it's bringing new people in the door and converting them into clients. So when I look over the body of work that I've created, I do not think it serves my client for me to have 1,000 blog posts, because will they ever get through them? Do they need to get through them? Is that a prerequisite in order to work with me? No, it's not at all. But I want them to find me and read or hear just enough that they're ready to take the next step. So honestly, every time I go out to plan my content calendar, I'm always looking at, okay, what can I plug in that we know is like our best series of content, whether it's a challenge, like the Best Year Ever challenge coming up, or we have other series that we have run before. And often if I go to run that series again, I might re-record it if there's something time sensitive or I say a date or something, but 9 times out of 10, I don't even need to do that. And having that asset in place, what it allows me to do is put my creative energy somewhere else. It allows me to put my creative energy back on my clients. So I'm able to create more resources and support and training and whatever for them. It also allows me to level up what we're doing. So because, for example, the Best Year Ever challenge, if I were to create this all from scratch, I would probably be looking at like our project board for it and be going like, holy crap, this is a lot of stuff. But 80% of the assets are done. The registration page there, the opt-in page and thank you page work together. The emails are there. The social media stuff is there. Like all we had to do was edit some workbooks, and I have to re-record it because it's impossible to edit out 2021 to 2022 1,000 times. So I just re-record it, but I have the script. And guess what? I can take that script, edit it, record it. I can record this challenge in under 3 hours. Yeah. That's how long it takes me to record it. And it allows us to put our time towards other things. So like this year, last year was bananas. It was 2020. This year, I have a little more bandwidth coming up. So I'm able to layer on additional marketing strategies like jumping on podcasts and talking about this challenge to invite you all to check out the challenge. I didn't have the bandwidth for that last year, but because it's an asset and it's so easy to rinse and repeat, it makes it way easier for me to up the ante on how we're going to run it this time.
Yeah. And I want to add, it also makes it easier for those people who are consuming year after year and those people who are sharing year after year to do that because they trust the experience they're going to have because it's not reinvented every year.
No,
because they're working a system. And when you're working a system, there's actually not a ton to change. And I think to your point, it allows you to pick the thing you want to upgrade this year. You know, for other clients, when we've done this, it'll be, okay, so this year we're actually going to do the same audios, but we're going to go all new graphics, or we're going to layer in some live Facebook live events or LinkedIn videos or whatever the sort of extra component they want to do. There's the space to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think above all, the reason I wanted you to come on and I wanted you to talk about this is it creates the space to do the selling part of the challenge. I think sometimes business owners get so burned out in the delivery of their free thing that there's no energy left to convert them.
Yeah.
And this is when you start building just a swamp of value that's actually of no service to your audience, your listeners, your readers, your watchers, whatever they are, your potential clients, your leads. It's of no value to them for them to be spending time swimming in your free content to the point where they just drown in information. They're only going to stay for so long. There's only so much action they're going to take. And if you don't put them in that decision point and hold their hand through what's next, there was no point of the energetic expenditure you took in creating the thing.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we can sell more on podcasts. And I think people realize, I think a lot of people get stuck on, well, this is free content. And I'm like, well, it is, but the purpose is to grow our business. So what is missing from the sales process? Often I find there's no call to actions to join the thing. Yep. And if there's no call to action to join the thing, then guess what? They're not going to join the thing. And then the other thing I find is we leave a lot of the information in a different platform. So here's what I love about podcasts is when people become podcast listeners, like they listen to everything, they binge everything. What's hard about them is they don't click out of the podcast very easily. Like you really have to be good to get them to go do the next thing. So I find even in my ecosystem, I will be doing an enrollment period for our program, the CEO Collective. And here's what'll happen. I'll have all these people join and I go to check and see how long they've been on our email list. And I'll find a bunch who it looks like they just joined our email list today. And then I'll find a bunch who've been on the email list for like 3 to 6 months. And then I'll go through our intake form and it's where did you find out about us? Podcast. Guess what? Those are the people who weren't on my email list.
Yep.
And if I didn't have that information, I wouldn't know how it all works. But because I specifically tell people what we offer on the podcast, because I bring on my clients to do interviews and case studies on the podcast,
and I mean, one.
And I've even had we've taken basically a webinar and plopped it on the podcast to say here's what it is. Let me walk you through the program. And I think people might not think about that because we're so used to it just being evergreen content. You can take a piece of content, like we've taken the open house before or a live Q&A and just popped it on the podcast for the week that we're enrolling. You can always take it down.
Yep.
You can always take it down.
And you can also go in and upload a new audio with just a changed promo at the end so that when people discover that episode later, it's, hey, we're not open. Enrollment's not open for this now, but get on our wait list because we open it every quarter, every 6 months, every 12 months, whatever it is. There's a lot of ways to do it. And I think sometimes we force ourselves into a box that doesn't actually exist. We force ourselves into a list of rules that doesn't actually exist. And I love that you talked about telling them what you do on the podcast. I think it's easy to get caught in the value and wanting to be a value and not wanting to be pushy. But again, I think the biggest service you can do is to tell them what's next and be really clear and transparent. For so long, transparency and authenticity have become buzzwords in marketing, but they're actually what work. They're that way because it's what works when it's real. And so frequently you'll hear me say on the show, hey guys, if you want to do this, let's talk. If you want to get support, Now is the time to talk, like, be really clear about what the next step is and when it's time to take that step. We have multiple episodes of the show that are actually just sales pages. Honestly, the how to work with uncommonly more and what working with uncommonly more looks like. It's legit the collection of sales pages in podcast form. Guess what? Every single client who has booked with us since we released those episodes, listen to them in their decision-making process.
Yes.
And almost none of them were on my email list.
I think that's so brilliant because I think we assume that people are, if they're following us in one place, they're following us in all places.
Nope.
And that is just not true. Like the minute you ask somebody to change platforms, there's a little bit of friction there, right? Yep. So that's why I try to keep people on the podcast until they're ready to make a decision. And because I know of all of the mediums I'm on, right? I have an email list, I have some social media, I have the podcast. I know that the people who listen to the podcast feel the most connected to me.
Yeah.
They have me in their earbuds, going on walks with them, going to the store, like working. I've even had people tell me that they listen to the podcast when they're in the shower and getting ready in the morning.
Those are my favorites. I'll get DMs from people. I listened to you in the shower this morning.
And I'm like, that is intimacy that I can't really get on other platforms. So why would I create the friction of asking people to go read the sales page when I can create an episode that walks them through the offer? Why would I make them go read the FAQs when I can get on and share some top questions about what it's like to work with us? And then when they've had a lot of that answered, then the friction is reduced because their questions are answered in advance.
And I would add to that, when you have people who maybe haven't been listening and are on your email list, or maybe they do listen and they're also on your email list, at every point, I get we'll send out with proposals. We will have people in a sales sequence that we're running. We're running various, like the sales page episodes of the show in those conversations. Yeah. I have somebody who reached out and wants to refer someone to me, and they're like, is there a good rundown for me to give them of what is involved? I could give them a sales page, but who wants to go look at that? Instead, I said, yeah, actually, this episode walks you through it. And so basically, I just had a sales call with this referral before I ever had to get on the phone with them, so that when we talk, it's a gut check. It's are you the same person who did the podcast? Because that's not universally true. Let's be honest. And there's some questions that need to be answered that are specific to them, and we just rock and roll through it. So I really love that. I don't want to get too deep into this and us totally lose track. And so as we wrap up, I want to make sure, let's talk specifically about the Best Year Ever Challenge and the fact that it's coming up. Give them an idea of what running this challenge looks like. I know I mentioned that there's a workbook that you do as well. You talk about that in the podcast. Are there any other calls to action in your challenge content itself, or is it just about putting them into the email list with the workbook?
Yeah, the Best Year Ever Challenge is really the entry point to working with us inside of the CEO Collective. So the Best Year Ever is all about designing your 12-month profit plan, because once you have clarity on what your marketing and sales strategy is going to look like in the year ahead, so we're coming up on 2022, then it becomes so much easier for us to work together and reverse engineer those goals and give you the tools and the templates and the systems and the strategies to actually make those happen. So we use it as a twofold thing. One, it is one of our best list builders, because this is just something that so many people need at this time of the year. So when we run this with the intention that, yes, it's going to be a front end list builder for getting all new people in. We also know that it's going to bring in existing people or people who've taken the challenge before who maybe weren't ready to work with us. And this gives them a nice refresher. What's awesome is, because it's an annual thing, they often pull up their workbooks. They can tell whether or not they made progress without support. And so if they do have those and they can tell that, oh, I could have gone faster or further if I would have had some support behind me, then guess what? They're going to be thinking this round, the CEO Collective is right for me. And so what we do is, at the end of this, we've given, during the 5 challenges, if we back up even then, we did multiple calls to actions to join us for the challenge before we started the challenge. The challenge runs live November 1st through 5th. Each day of the challenge, we're saying, hey, we have the audio here available for you absolutely free. And if you want the workbook, which is truly where the magic happens, so that you have that documented plan and you can follow this system without skipping anything, go here and grab the workbook. And then they get invited into the CEO Collective and we walk them through our enrollment process. We will also leave this challenge to run on Evergreen after we run it live. And the reason we do this, we do the same thing with the Fired Up and Focused Challenge, is because it's something that when you hit the right timing on something, you want to get the maximum amount out of it. So we know this is a massive audience builder for us. We know that it gets people listening to the podcast. And even if they're not ready to buy right now, even if they're not ready to start the CEO Collective Q1 2022, we know, because we have the data, that often in 3 months, 6 months of them following me and listening to the podcast, that those that are ready will take action 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now. So we really front load a lot of our list building efforts with this challenge for the whole year ahead.
I love that. And I think that speaks to the power of having a really strategic perspective on what's putting out. We're building on what's been released. Part of that is by repurposing. Part of that is filling in the gaps on things we've learned new. Some of that is featuring things like client conversations, case studies, but it really builds upon itself. And I think when you're just focused on getting your next episode up and out, it is impossible for you to leverage this medium that way. And so it has to first be taking a step back. Where can they find the Best Year Ever Challenge? Because it is about to start in just a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. Where do they go to sign up so that you guys can see this in action?
So go to rachealcook.com/BYE. And then you will not only get access to the challenge, but you will get the workbooks. You'll also get updates for when we're going live. That week we're running it live, where I'm doing some extra live conversations and answering questions live as people are working through the material.
Which again is possible because this is something that is an asset and runs over and over again. So you have the capacity to do that. Yay. Exactly. Awesome. I'm super excited. I also want to remind everyone to go check out Racheal's podcast. There'll be links to all of this in the show notes. The Promote Yourself to CEO podcast is probably one of my favorite podcasts. I listened to it long before we started producing it. Possibly because when we launched our podcasts, because I launched my podcast initially in 2013 as well. When we started podcasting, there were not a lot of us in podcasting. No. There was a lot of tech bros.
Yep.
I mean, there still is, but there were a lot of tech bros and a lot of comedian bros, but there was not a lot of women just sharing actually valuable and wonderful information.
Exactly. So, and there's still not enough. So
there's not. So let's get on that. All right. I want to wrap us up. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and for sharing inside of that. I will have links to everything Racheal mentioned in the show notes. Make sure you go and connect with her. But thanks, Rach.
Thank you so much.
If you made it to this point of the show and you still happen to be listening, which statistically is unlikely, I want to say thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I want to hear from you. So reach out on social or via email and let me know what actions you're going to take from today's episode, because honestly, that's why we produce the show. That's why I record this show. It's why my team does all the work to release this show, is so that we can help you. We can help make a difference in your show and consequently in your business. If you haven't left a review for the show, head over to ratethispod.com/more. It's an easy way to show some love to the show and also help us reach more podcasters who are looking for the same kind of support you were looking for. If you have any suggestions or ideas or thoughts you would like me to address on the show, be sure to reach out. Again, like I say a lot, this is the start of the conversation, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.